Hey there, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John, and today we're talking about microsociological theories of socialization. Doesn't mean very small theories, we're talking more about the social, psychological, and ethnographic approaches. So I want to start by talking about Sigmund Freud, who was a psychologist. But his ideas about, some of his ideas about socialization are relevant here. So you may have heard of something called the Oedipal complex. Let me just describe briefly what this is about. So this is based on an ancient Greek play called Oedipus Rex. In the play, Oedipus is the son of a king. He's born to a king, but a prophecy says he's going to kill his father and marry his mother. So, of course, the father decides to have him killed, because that's what they did in ancient Greece. So they give him to a goat herder to kill him, and the goat herder takes him out and, of course, falls in love with the baby. He can't kill him, so he ends up giving him to some relatives in a distant cottage. Hopefully, nobody will ever know. And the child grows up in this cottage thinking he's the son of this family. So when he grows up, he becomes a man. He's big and strapping because he's been living his life out in the fields. And he decides to go to the nearest city to seek his fortune. And on his way, he meets this old man on the road. They have an argument. They fight. He kills the old man. Then he comes to the city, and everybody in the city is like running around. They don't know what happened to their king. Their king got killed, and they have this horrible disease, and the disease won't go away until somebody solves a riddle. Now, Oedipus happens to know the answer to the riddle. He solves it. I'm not going to get into all those details. And they say, "Oh, you're so brilliant. Why don't you become our king?" And in order to become the king, he has to marry the queen. So he marries the queen, and over the years, they're very happy. They have children. And of course, as you probably guessed by now, he eventually finds out that he, in fact, killed his own father, who was the old man on the road, and has married his own mother, who is the queen. And it turns out the prophecy came true, and he goes out into the wilderness and gouges his eyes out. So that's the story of Oedipus. But what's the point? So Sigmund Freud thought this was an analogy for the socialization process. Basically, he felt what the Greeks were saying was something universal. That when we're a baby, we feel we want to be with our mother. We want to just be with our mother all the time. She satisfies our need for food, our need for comfort. And this he calls the id. The id is this desire for basic satisfaction that we have. Now, of course, as we get older, we realize there's a father, and the father is a rival for our mother's affection. So, according to Freud, we hate our father, but he's a lot bigger than us, so we fear him. So what we have to do is repress the desire we have for our mother. So this desire is repressed by internalizing the father figure, right? And when we do that, we internalize the need and the respect for social rules and norms. This becomes the superego. So we have the id, that's our basic desires. They're still there, but they're now buried. On top of it is the superego, squishing it down, right? Repressing it. And then above that is our ego. Our ego is our conscious self. And the ego is the result of the conflict between the superego and the id. So his theory was that everybody goes through this, but if some people don't have a father figure, they will not develop a strong superego, so they will have a very powerful id. Their id will tell them to go and do terrible things. We will become a psychopath. On the other hand, if the father figure is too strong, then the superego is too strong, and we come out as neurotics. We come out fearing everything. So this idea, we either become psychopaths or neurotics, or hopefully we maintain a balance, right? The argument was this helps to explain a lot about socialization, right? Because obviously whether we become a psychopath or a neurotic or we're normal is obviously a process of socialization, right? So just showing this chart here, right? So the id is our basic nature and desires. We must repress these in order to be a good person. Our superego are the social norms, rules, norms, and values. These we must internalize until we believe they are our own. These are our beliefs, our values, our norms. And then we have the conscious self. So that's the idea of who we are in between the values and in between the desires. And now, of course, a lot of people have criticized Freud. They basically, one argument is that he assumes that everybody goes through this process, that everybody has an overarching repressive father figure, which is not always true, right? And they don't always necessarily become neurotics or psychopaths as a result. So it may be this helps explain his period, middle 19th century European Europe, which is very patriarchal and male-dominated, but it also doesn't explain what norms and values you have, only that you have some, right? But where do those norms and values come from? And it doesn't. It only explains why people might deviate from them once we have them. Now another guy is another social psychologist. His name was Cooley, and he developed a concept called the looking glass self. And basically, he believed that as we grow up, we obviously can't see ourselves, right? I mean, I can see my hands. I can see my body. I can see myself in the TV set, right, or in a mirror. And this is what he uses, this analogy of the mirror, or the looking glass self. So we can only see ourselves in a mirror. So the mirror tells us what we look like. Okay, but are we a good or a bad person? Well, the mirror won't tell us that, but society tells us that. So in a certain sense, we are looking at ourselves in society. If that makes any sense to you. So, for example, we imagine how other people see us, and that becomes our conception of self. We view ourselves as we believe others view us, in other words. And so we're using the perspective of others in a certain sense, even though we're still focused on the self. And so one thing this gives us is a self-image, a sense of who we are at a certain moment. So if I get dressed up, my self-image is, look at me, I'm a cool dude, I'm all dressed up, ready to go out party. Right? On the other hand, if I'm lazy and tired and I'm dressed in horrible clothes, my self-image will be, I feel like a bum today, I don't feel like doing anything, I just want to lie on the sofa and sleep. Now that's a little different from our self-concept. Our self-concept is who we think of ourselves as a person. So we might say, well, I'm all dressed up, but normally I prefer to just stay home. So our self-image, being temporary, may be different in a particular moment from our self-concept. Right? We'd say, normally I like to stay home and relax, but tonight I'm going to go out and be the best dressed person in town. Right? So that's the difference in image and concept. And then self-evaluation is very important. This is the process by which we look for clues in other people's reactions to us. So when we go out and other people say, hey, you're looking good, Dr. John, I'm like, hey, I'm good, yay, right? On the other hand, if I go out and they're all like avoiding looking at me, I'll be like, maybe do I have toilet paper on my shoes? So I forget to check my zipper? And you start to doubt yourself. Right? Now this then can affect your self-esteem. Self-esteem is related to self-conception. It's how highly you think of yourself. And some people, if you go through life and people are always looking down at you, will develop low self-esteem. Other people, they go through life and people are always praising them, may develop high self-esteem. Because we're always engaged in this process of comparing ourselves to other people, and of course we're obsessed with the concept of personal efficacy, the idea that I'm a useful person as opposed to just being a good person. Mead developed a somewhat similar theory. He called it let's go through it, the generalized other theory, it's how it's normally called. He divided the self between the me and the I. So the I is the subject. So if you know anything about grammar, subjects act. For example, I kick the ball, right? So I am doing something. That's the focus of the I. So when you're thinking to yourself, what am I going to do today? What am I going to say to so-and-so? How am I going to get my homework done? Right? You're thinking as an I, as an active subject. And you're not really thinking much about who you are, right? You're just saying, I need to do this, I need to do that. It's very active. On the other hand, the me is an object. Right? So me is something that things happen to. So when you think of me, you're thinking about who is this person inside, right? How is the me being impacted by the actions of other people? Right? So you might say, if I do something, people will see me as something else, right? So let's say I go and I steal money, right? And I get caught, right? People will think I'm a thief, right? So that's going to affect their perception of me, and it's going to then affect my perception of myself. I'll be like, well, I must be a thief because look, everybody thinks I'm a thief. So what do? Do I end up taking the risk, stealing the money, and taking the risk of getting caught and believed to be a thief? Or do I not take the money, maybe go hungry, but at least I can hold my head high and say, well, nobody thinks I'm a thief? So Mead went on to talk about how people, or children rather, form their sense of self over time through three specific stages. So the first stage, and this is very similar to Piaget, but notice the difference in terms of the relationships between things. So the first stage is the play stage. Again, this is between the ages of 2 and 6. And at this stage, children basically play a particular role. So I'm going to be a policeman. I'm going to be a fireman. I'm going to be a father or a doctor. Typically, it's a role they've seen on TV, or maybe a role played by some significant other in their life, mother or father, somebody close to them. And you'll notice when they play, their impression is very one-sided. Basically, whatever they see, that's to them the role. So the role is only specific types of attitudes, and it doesn't really relate to any other role. It's like, I'm a policeman, this is what I do. Well, policemen relate to robbers. You can play cops and robbers. Doctors relate to nurses. You can play so on and so forth. So the second stage, usually when children are about 6 or 7, is the game stage. So you notice when you have a 4 or 5-year-old and you try to get them to play a game like soccer, or let's say a game like Monopoly with specific rules and you have to make these decisions, they will not get into it because they don't understand what the point is. But the game, once they get to 6 or 7, they're able to understand the idea of playing a game with several different roles in it, which are competing in the case of most of our games, right? So if I'm the car, I go vroom vroom, I buy the property. If you land on it, you have to pay me money. If I land on you, so they can see that the game involves roles that have relationships with each other. And now, of course, these roles are still very simplistic. And obviously, if you think of any game, even like soccer or football, the rules of the game keep the dynamics of the game at a very simple level, so that people playing soccer, for example, don't start pulling out guns and shooting each other, right? So you're supposed to win, but within the rules, right? Now, the next stage is the concept of the generalized others. So in the game stage, we're playing a game. We don't necessarily have to understand the rules. We just have to follow them, right? In the game, we're interacting with multiple different roles at the same time, but we don't have to understand the concept of culture or society. We just follow the specific rules. In the generalized other stage, we don't need specific rules because at this point, we understand that society is expecting certain types of behavior from us. And so this is what we call the generalized other. The generalized other is, quote unquote, society itself. And when we're at this stage, we're able to abstractly understand our obligation to society, and vice versa. And so this doesn't usually happen until 12 or 13. In some cases, it may never happen at all. Some people may become trapped at the game stage where they see life simply as a game with specific rules that you can try to break if you can get away with it. Right? But in the generalized other stage, you would realize that you can't break the rules because all of society is enforcing them. Now, social communication is the process by which we transmit information and ideas to each other, and of course, it's very important to socialization because the constant communication is what establishes a commonality between people, and this is primarily from a microsociological perspective. The people constantly recreate norms and values and how to do things between themselves on a regular basis. They reinforce it by reminding each other, essentially, by what is the norm, what is the proper way of doing things. Verbal communication, of course, is how we speak to each other. And humans, one of our genetic components is our ability to learn language, which is a quite complex issue and must have developed in tandem with social development and human development in the distant past. But we don't know language when we're born. We only have the disposition. We have to learn a specific language from the people around us. So, of course, wherever we are born, typically, we're going to learn the language of that area from our parents, from our friends. And it's always very interesting also when you look at immigrants who go from one country to another. It may be very difficult for the parents to learn the new language, but the children will very often grow up knowing the new language or learning the new language immediately because of their interaction with peers and friends and just TV, whereas the parents may struggle. So we have that disposition to learn, and it's usually very early that we find it obviously easy to learn a language. Nonverbal communication is also very important. The way we use our bodies, the way we hand gestures, all of this is also, or most of it is also culturally determined. Parts of it may have a genetic basis. So, for example, fear, how people react to fear, a part of that is probably genetic, going back years, millions of years in our in our evolution. So, for example, many animals, I should say, sponge up when they're afraid. And we do that also. We tend to, the hair on the back of our head goes up. We feel it. When we're afraid of something, you feel like, oh, a creepy feeling. That's your hair going up on the back of your head. And that's the same reaction a cat or a dog will have when they're faced with a fear situation. You sponge up, and in sponging up, you look bigger. I'm not going to go into all the details of non-emotional, or rather non-verbal communication, but there are many, many ways in which we do it. And in fact, when we think about emotional expression, we express our emotions primarily through our body language, the way we hold our bodies. So if we look like this, our emotional body language is that we're bored, or we're tired maybe, or we simply don't like the people we're around. We're giving it generally a negative emotional expression to other people. So think of that. If you have a tendency to cross your arms, it may just be a habit, like you've gotten used to it, but it gives off a message that people are going to read that you are not a very social person. Right? It may be true. Also vocal, the way we say something. So, of course, if I said something like, I love you, you're going to get the impression that I don't like you very much, even though I use the words I love you, but you get the emotion from my voice and the way I shape my face. Keep in mind, not all nonverbal communication is genetic. There's a mix. A lot of it is cultural. Using the OK sign may seem good in some cultures, but in other cultures it may be very rude. So always be very careful using hand gestures in places outside your own culture. Just put it that way. Symbolic interactionism focuses on reflexive behavior. In other words, the way people react to other people changes our reaction. So I reflect my behavior through others. This is actually very similar to what Cooley talked about in terms of the looking glass mirror. Also keep in mind something called the Thomas theorem. If people define a situation as real, it is real in its consequences. So we call this also a self-fulfilling prophecy, or the quote-unquote definition of the situation. This is how we interpret or attribute meaning to a particular situation or to our circumstances. So, for example, if I see somebody as a threat, I see somebody walking down the street and I think of them as a threat, I will react to that. Maybe I cross the road, or maybe I will become aggressive. Either way, I am treating the situation as real, and it is becoming real in its consequences. If I cross the road, therefore I will no longer have a positive interaction with that person. If I take the threat very seriously and do a counter threat, I'm going to create a reaction that then will create a negative situation. When you think about the situation we have today with police and African Americans as well as other groups in terms of police brutality, a lot of this is because of this phenomena. The police officer sees the person as a threat, maybe because of an internal bias or because of past experiences that they have amalgamated into basically a stereotype. So therefore they become extra aggressive. This then elicits an aggressive reaction on the part of the other person. And therefore you create a conflict situation where a conflict situation was not necessary. And so often when you look at these cases, you find out that at the end of the day, it was basically a miscommunication, but this miscommunication may end up in people getting killed. And sometimes that can happen on a grand scale, such as when you think about the beginning of World War I, where people miscommunicated, there was no real desire to go to war, but everybody just assumed that everybody else would go to war, so they went to war. They also assumed it wouldn't be a big deal, and it ended up killing millions and millions and millions and millions of people. Half the population of some countries were decimated by that. So again, what we need to think about is how people react to situations can create sometimes a positive outcome or a negative outcome. But the point is we need to look at that process, and that's what symbolic interactionism deals with. Garfinkel developed a field he called ethnomethodology, and he questioned the idea that norms and values exist in the social structure, which is the general assumption of functionalists. These norms and values somehow exist independent of individuals. And remember what Durkheim said, that a social fact had to be independent of individuals. But Garfinkel believed the opposite, that in fact norms and values are created in the process of interaction. Now, that interaction, of course, is still between individuals, but it's the process that creates the norms and values. This is why he said ethno. Ethno means folk or people. In other words, the people's methods. It's the study of people's methods of establishing normality. So one way he used to prove this, in a sense, was to use breach experiments. A breach experiment, for example, he would have students go out and break a rule, break a norm, breach a norm. Not a terrible norm, but for example, he would tell his students, go into an elevator and stand looking the wrong way. Instead of looking at the door, look at somebody else. And this was a breach. How do you know it was a breach of normality? Because people reacted. How did they react? They tried to re-normalize the situation. They would either correct them, say, you're supposed to look that way, or they would fidget, or they would sometimes they would get upset. They believed that the person was deliberately antagonizing them. Other experiments he did, for example, he told his students to go home and act extra polite around everybody, as if he were a stranger in his own house. So ask permission for the tea, ask permission for coffee, ask permission to use the bathroom. And again, he found that telling his students to be polite in a situation in which they were not supposed to be polite caused a lot of problems that the families couldn't understand, and they tried to reimpose a normality on those individuals. So what he said is we have to study group behavior by participating in that behavior in order to really understand not just what the norms are, but how they're created, how they're constructed. You couldn't do this just by being a disinterested observer. But that is obviously somewhat controversial, because most social scientists believe that you have to stand back and you have to remain impartial to what's going on. On the contrary, Garfinkel said you had to get involved and you had to sometimes disrupt things to see what the real processes were. So for example, when you go to a supermarket and you look at how people line up, and this is one of his favorite examples, he felt that the people in the line would reestablish the norm of the line. If somebody, for example, was not behaving in the right way, if they're looking the wrong way, if the line moves that they haven't moved up, other people will be like, nudge them, or would say, well, could you move up? In other words, they would reestablish constantly the normative situation of the line. And then what is the value behind that? You have to think about what are the values behind line forming behavior? Is it equality because everybody should be taken in turn? Is it simply organization or efficiency? So all of these are things that Garfinkel said we should do in our everyday life to question our notions of what the norms and values around us are. Goffman, another very important ethnomethodologist, developed what he called the concept of impression management. The idea is that we invest ourselves, we spend time trying to present ourselves in a particular way to other people. In other words, if I'm going for a job interview, I'm not going to go in dressed like a slob. I'm going to get all dressed up. I'm going to stand erect. I'm going to be prepared. And is this the normal me? No, it's not the normal me. Right? Again, go on a first date. Most people would probably dress up and try to present, one would say, a best impression of themselves. He called this the dramaturgical approach. Goffman tried to be an actor at one time. That was his life goal when he was young. And so maybe he took it into his sociology. But again, the idea of the dramaturgical approach is we're always playing a role. And it fits with the notion of roles in macrosociology, the idea that everybody has a role and we play different roles. But Goffman gave it much more of a microsociological twist in saying that we are actively participating in creating and imagining these roles, and sometimes we adjust them. So for example, if you're a waiter, you don't just have one role, you really have two. You have a front stage where you act for the waiter, for your customers, and of course you're very polite and you give them everything they want and you serve them in such and such a way. And then when you go backstage, you will act a different way for your friends or your colleagues, the other waiters and maybe the kitchen staff. And maybe back there you'll be like, oh, those guys on table 5 are terrible and they don't give a good tip and I hate them and they smell. So you're even in one role, you'll have many different, again, statuses or applications to things. Another thing he pointed out is face saving. In other words, when we're invested in a situation, everybody tries to help maintain the normality of that situation. So imagine, for example, if the President of the United States or the Queen of England comes to a big ceremony, and everybody's standing around ceremonially in their ceremonial best dress, and suddenly the President or the Queen gives a big fart. Like, what do? Well, normally everybody just ignores it. Why? Because you don't want to destroy the illusion of the event, because everybody is invested in the event. Now, if somebody's not invested, they might disrupt it by laughing or something like that. But generally speaking, many of these ceremonies were all invested. You know, if your boss farts and you laugh, maybe that's your job on the line. So we pretend it didn't happen. In other words, we save face. And many times, if you look at your behavior or other people's behaviors, we help people by helping them save face. And if you think about it, it's very smart, because the alternative is to create a big fight or a big confrontation or an embarrassment that may bode not well for either you or the other person. So anyway, I hope these ideas have been interesting for you. Don't do anything embarrassing, I hope. And have a good day. Make sure you check the companion for review and any additional assignments. All right, bye.